Hi, this is Adam from MakerState, and right now I'm going to walk you through Scratch Science, Velocity, Acceleration, and Drag. So in this challenge, we're going to program a simulation where the forces of acceleration, drag, affect the velocity of a flying object. And we're going to create movement similar to the spaceship in the video game Asteroids. So to get started, I'm going to delete this cat sprite. I'm going to add this spaceship sprite from the library, and one thing we need to do to get this spaceship sprite to fly the right way is tilt it to the right, and it will become a little more apparent why we need to do this once we start writing some scripts and moving this thing around, but just trust me for now that we need to tilt. If you use the spaceship sprite, tilt it to the right. I'm going to choose this costume, and I'm also going to choose a backdrop. I'm going to use the stars backdrop, and I'm going to shrink my spaceship down using the shrinking arrow tools right there. And now I can begin to write some scripts. And making sure I've clicked on my spaceship before I start writing scripts. And in the past we might have written something like this for this movement. When green flag clicked, forever, if up arrow pressed, we move 10 steps forward, and then if right arrow pressed, maybe we turn right, and we can duplicate this, and say if left arrow pressed, oops, we'll turn to the left. And we'd have something like this. And this isn't so bad, this accomplishes our basic goals, but this is inherently unrealistic because our spaceship is doing this thing where it stops on a dime and starts on a dime. It's basically moving or it's not moving. And in the real world, things don't just move or not move. Well, they can move or not move, but they move at varying speeds. They speed up and they slow down. They don't just go right to the only speed that they move at. So in order to program that, we're going to need to find a way to move the ship at a varying number of steps. And that word vary leads us to the fact that we're going to have to use a variable to create a mechanism for moving our ship where it can speed up and slow down the way it would in real life. So I'm going to create a variable and call it velocity. And if this word is new to you, it basically means the same thing as speed, except it takes into account direction. So you can have positive velocity or negative velocity if you're moving backward. Whereas we wouldn't really talk about negative speed in technical circumstances. Okay, so we have a velocity variable, and if we look at our program that we've started to create over here, we can start to take some guesses about where we're going to substitute in this variable. And the answer is we're going to put this into this move 10 steps block right here, move velocity steps. Now, one thing we're going to change is we don't only want to move velocity steps when the up arrow is pressed. We actually want to be moving by our velocity all the time, and then we're going to adjust the velocity by adding acceleration and drag. Acceleration to raise the velocity, and drag to bring it back down close to zero. Okay? So that brings me to what we're going to replace this with inside of this if up arrow pressed loop right here. And we're going to use a change block to change velocity by 1 when the up arrow is pressed, such that our velocity will increase when we press the up arrow, just like pressing the gas pedal on a car, right? And if we check this out, we see that this works, and I can see my velocity up here in the top left. And as I press more, the ship goes faster and faster and faster and faster. And we're just adding to the velocity, and right now nothing in our program is shrinking this velocity, right? So it's always going to keep flying faster, and eventually it's going to get out of control, and we're not going to be able to stop it. And we have to think about what we're going to do to make this spaceship slow down and come back down closer to zero when we're not pressing the up arrow. And for this, we need to program a force called drag. And there's a few different ways mathematically to program this. The way I like to do this is to forever, inside this forever loop, we're going to set velocity to be part of what it was before. So it's not going to be all of the velocity. We're almost going to take a percentage of the velocity and say, let's keep 95% of the velocity and we'll lose 5% to our drag force as we move through the air and the air pushes back on us, right? So the way we can program this, we have set velocity to 0. Instead of setting it to 0, I'm going to take one of these velocity variables and leave it down here because I'm going to need it in a second, and use a multiplication block from operators. And what I'm going to do is say set velocity to velocity times a number that's going to let me keep 95% of my velocity. And the way to do that is to put 0.95 in here. That's how we can represent that percentage inside this percentage block. Inside this multiplication block. And now, if we run this one more time, let's see where my ship wound up. Okay, good. Now I can accelerate by pressing the up arrow, and then my ship will slow back down to not moving. And of course, I can adjust these numbers to try out different, different styles of movement, different characteristics of having a higher velocity or a higher or lower kind of friction or drag coefficient over here. And what we can do to make this easier is actually create variables for both of these things. So the way we can do that is go back to data. Stop this for a moment, go back to data, and I'm going to create two more variables called acceleration, and drag. And again, acceleration is the force that's going to speed us up, it's going to raise velocity, and drag is going to push back and lessen velocity, bring it closer to 0. That's one important thing to note. Drag won't bring velocity below 0. It will only bring it back to 0, right? So, and that's given that our velocity is positive initially. Right now we haven't programmed anything that's going to make our ship go backwards. So for the meantime, this velocity times 0.95 is going to shrink velocity back to 0, not necessarily subtract from it, which is an important distinction to make. Anyway, what we can do to insert these variables into our program is, first, let's set them at the top of our program. This is called initializing our variables, we could say. And I'm going to set acceleration to 1 because we're going to end up replacing acceleration here, and that 1 is working fine. And I'm going to set drag to 0.96. I'm going to bring it just a tiny bit higher because I was feeling that it was dragging a little bit too much, actually. So now I'm going to have it at 0.96, and then we're going to take these variables, acceleration, and pop it in here, and drag, pop it in here. And now we have that same behavior that we had before, but I can easily go in right at the top of my program and say, how does this feel when I have an acceleration of 3? Now my ship accelerates much faster. It still slows down pretty quickly. And one important thing to note just about the way that this drag formula is working up here, this works such that ships experience more drag when their velocity is higher, right? And that makes sense because the faster you move, the more the air is going to push back against you. Whereas for something that's not moving at all, if my velocity was 0, my drag would also be 0 because I'm not moving and there's nothing pushing back against me, if that makes sense. So this is where we're going to leave it for this project, but there are a lot of cool things that you can do with this now that you have this physics engine, so to speak, set up over here. You could create a game where your where your acceleration or your drag are changed by collecting different objects or by being in different levels or different parts of the game, right? Or you could try to recreate other aspects of asteroids, try to make some asteroids and make it so that you have to avoid them, and you could adjust your acceleration or your velocity or other things based on what level in that game you're in. You could try to replicate the laser from asteroids using cloning blocks. That's another good challenge. There are many things you can do with this kind of system once you have it built, and I hope you try some of them. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and hope you come watch the next Scratch Science video. Okay, thanks. Bye.